At the end of, by Dayton, by the end of 95, the Croats had taken back their territory. There was a mission that lasted until early 98 in eastern Slavonia, on that area bordering on Serbia. That handed over to a kind of a monitoring mission of OSCE, and in the period subsequent, there have been, the OSCE has continued to monitor, UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees, UNDP, the development program, HCR, UNDP, and OSCE. And so they're there and they're doing things. But they're mainly doing things in areas of Serb return, which will be relevant in a minute. That is, all these areas that had been the former Sector North, Sector South, south of Zagreb as you go, cut over, and then go down to the coast, or just inside from the coast in Zagreb, places like Slun, Knin, and places like that. They're very active in helping facilitate the return of Serbs, in helping them get their civil rights and all this kind of stuff, various sorts of rights of protection and all that sort of things, in areas where they're not necessarily protected, where there are no Serbian police. The only place that, and this is the only place where there's a genuinely multi-ethnic police, in any numbers, is in eastern Slavonia, where we who worked in UNTACE told the Croats, you're going to have a multi-ethnic police. If you want us to leave, part of the conditions is that you hire a whole lot of Serbs as police, and that they continue to work as police. And so still today, they continue to work there, and even the Croat officials who might not particularly be very fond of Serbs will admit that it works there, and they'll also say how that's actually a pretty good thing because it buys them points with the international community and all that kind of stuff. So then anyways, if you look at the perceptions of the international community officials in the police reform, so in Croatia, it makes sense that there's almost no impact. And, all of the policing money in Croatia, it all comes from sort of EU, various kinds of EU cards funding and various other things, USAID working on small kinds of projects, study tours of sort of police leaders to kind of, these guys to go to visit the FBI to see how they manage cases and all that kind of stuff, and various all over the world, but it's very low profile. There aren't a lot of white cars in Croatia, and so that people generally don't know that the international community is doing anything in policing. Whereas in Kosovo, there's still, Pristina is beset by UN white cars. I had an anthropologist friend, an American, but who's been living in Sweden for about 25 years, who came to me when I was in Kosovo in '99. He said, I just wrote a paper called White Jeep States, in which he was really talking about places like Bosnia and Kosovo, that places where there are white Jeep states, and this really obtains for places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But we thought that in Kosovo a bit too, is that white Jeep states are places where the white Jeeps all kind of go around in circles like, the old days of Westerns and Indians, you would kind of circle the wagons. You don't go out at night. It's all this, that there are these big differences. And so, and if you look, what the perceptions are of the role that we played in Kosovo, they love us because it was in a period of foreign domination in which they gained their independence. Much more mixed in Bosnia. The Serbs, the Croats are unhappy, and in Macedonia, it's about half. When you go to the next slide and you unpack this a little bit, this becomes interesting because looking again at the Serbs, you see that the Serbs view the international community, almost 2/3 thinks that it was that we've done a great thing, and that's because they look to us. They look to us for protection. They look to us to help them in a way that they're not being helped domestically. And so, whereas the Croats, only 1/3 of them say it's positive, and and almost half say it's no impact. Whereas, similarly in Macedonia, you see that the Albanians, the minority there, looked to the international community who was being seen as helping advance the Albanian cause in the Ohrid Agreement. Whereas it's a much more mixed situation in Bosnia. And in Kosovo, of course, 28% or 20.5% of the Serbs think it's okay, but almost 90% of the Albanians think it's okay. And again, that becomes a surrogate for the international project. To the next one. So what are some of the patterns that we observe? First is that, in general, no matter where we are, people are happy with the police. I mean, the police provide security. There's some high-profile crimes. Occasionally people get beat up. There's occasional interethnic thing here and there. But overall, if you do a survey, people say they're pretty happy, and they're pretty happy all over. And they also say that there's pretty good relations between the police and the communities. That's just the way it is. And we already talked about how the European Commission was critical of all the police services. But the third bullet is what becomes really most interesting, the inconsistent approach between various international organizations and various governments. I could have thrown in others besides the U.S. But, it's the case where in Bosnia, for example, there was a UN mission that had some executive authority until the beginning of 2002. Between early 96 and early 2002. When it left, the EU took over. Well, the day before it left, Ambassador Klein, who was the head of the mission, he decertified several hundred police. And when he decertified the police, he then went home, and those police were not given an address to turn to if they wanted to question their decertification. If they felt, which is in the case of some of them, probably not a whole lot, but of some of them, that they were probably unjustly decertified. And even if they were justly decertified, they certainly had earned the right of redress, of having their cases heard. Yet, so these guys turned to the new EU policing mission, who had no executive authority or anything, and they said, hey, that's not us. Go see the UN. But guess what? There was no UN there anymore. There was no place that they could talk to. So they went around to OHR, and OHR then brought this to New York, and well, here it is, 6 years later, 6.5 years later. I was in Sarajevo this summer, and these decertified police are camping up outside of OHR and going on hunger strikes because they still hadn't yet received this. And so that's just one anecdote of one little thing that speaks to a rather awkward transition between the UN and the EU. And I can go on to talk about all kinds of stovepipes, different kinds of mandates, people who show up in country who know nothing about the country that they're working in, who don't really understand the mandate, who don't coordinate well, because at the end of the day, if I work for the OSCE, my accountability, is it to Vienna or is it to Washington? If I work for, if I'm a UN employee, my accountability, if I'm UN blue, I mean, within the UN we talk about people that are UN, they say his blood runs UN blue. If your blood runs UN blue, then your accountability really is to New York. But if your blood isn't UN blue, then, well, who knows? Does it go to Paris? Does it go to Ouagadougou before it goes? There's all kinds of places that it could go to before it goes to New York, let alone the kind of ways in which there's coordination. On the ground in Kosovo, I talked to a kind of a, well, he wasn't one of the senior, but he was a high-ranking middle Kosovar in the ministry, who talked about people that are co-located. Well, one of the things that we do is we co-locate internationals with locals, whether it's in judiciary or whether in the police and all this, and you use them to help them kind of introduce modern policing techniques and practices and how we do things, whether it's, we teach them how to do things like criminal protection programs, witness protection programs, or things like that. And, well, in Pristina, these guys will come in. They'll be there for 6 months or a year. They'll come in by 10, usually not earlier. They'll leave at 2, and they'll go to wherever they have to go. And then they'll do what they do. None of them spoke Albanian. None of them spoke Serbian or Turkish. Turkish wouldn't have helped much in Pristina. But they didn't speak any of the local languages. And but they achieve something. And then when they leave, they take it all with them. And then a policeman from another country comes. And then he tries to introduce things. And so there isn't any kind of add-on follow-on. There are no, by the way, easy solutions to this. Each of these issues requires lots of thinking about how are we going to do this right. And that thinking has not gone on. And in the peace operations community, which Washington is a kind of a central node at USIP and other places, and there's still a lot of work to be done on that. And so it hasn't taken place.